Hi there, welcome to Explain This, a podcast where we try to explain complex things in simpler ways for people of all ages. I'm your host Jin Kim, and today we're finally back from our long hiatus, with no more exams left in my life, so I actually get to have a life now and make all the content I want. Whee! So, to welcome us back to a new season of Explain This, let's explore the wondrous, magical, happy world of death. Oh yeah, we don't muck around on this show. Now, obviously, death can be a sensitive topic, so listener discretion is advised for this episode, especially if you have little ones running around. There will be mentions of suicide, violent deaths, and details on what happens to our bodies after we die, so please feel free to give this one a skip if any of those topics may be a trigger for you. With that out of the way, let's get started. Back in 1716, British dramatist Christopher Bullock famously said, "'Tis impossible to be sure of anything but death and taxes." If you thought it was a Benjamin Franklin quote, don't worry, apparently everything is misattributed to Benjamin Franklin and Albert Einstein on the internet nowadays. Death is the inevitable end for us all. No matter how rich or famous or enlightened you are, or how much you do yoga, eat only salads, you will die someday. It could be in 50 years' time, or it could be tomorrow, it could happen any time. So, of course, with it being a universal certainty, human beings have been fascinated by the concept of death since the dawn of time. In today's episode, we'll talk about what happens when you die. Not in the spiritual sense of whether there is an afterlife or not, or your soul or whatever, but more in the scientific sense, like what actually causes you to die, and what happens to your body when you pass away. Now, since I don't want anyone mistaking this podcast for an actual guide on how to teach children the concept of dying, we'll skip explaining it to you as if you were a child. Instead, let's teach it to you as if you were a curious teenager learning about human biology, about what happens to your body during the process of death. The human body is an amazingly complex system that relies on the cooperation of many different organs to stay alive. There's the lungs that breathe in oxygen to fuel cells and breathe out poisonous carbon dioxide. There's the heart that pumps freshly oxygenated blood around the body while carrying away the waste products and toxins. There's the kidneys and liver that filter out said waste products so that it doesn't build up and kill you. And there's the brain that coordinates all of these activities to keep the system balanced. You can listen to episode 34 to learn more about how the vital organs actually work. The general gist of what the body is trying to do is maintain balance, like the Avatar, so that the cells in your body can all work in harmony in just the right environment with enough fuel. If the balance is upset, because say the Fire Nation attacked and destroyed your lungs, the body will try everything in its power to fix things up to restore balance. But as marvelous as the body is, sometimes it just can't restore the balance, there's too much damage. If this happens, lots of different vicious cycles make conditions worse and worse for your cells, such as being too cold, too acidic, not having enough fresh fuel like oxygen and sugars provided on demand, or toxic waste building up. Eventually, there reaches a point where the cells just can't function, and they go kaput. Cells start dying left, right, and center as their inner workings fail and their protective bubbles burst, which causes a cascade of more badness, as other cells relying on these cells also start dying. When things get really bad is when your brain cells start dying, which happens about 3 to 5 minutes after the brain stops getting blood pumped into it, such as when your heart stops beating, or the pressure inside your skull is way too high because of a brain bleed. The brain is where you are. Your memories, your personality, your motivations and dreams, and everything that makes you, you. So when the brain dies, you die. Once the brain is dead and the heart and lungs completely fail, we can safely say that a body is truly and irreversibly dead. After death, the rest of the body packs it up and loses all functions as well, because there's nothing keeping the cells alive. No fresh blood, no oxygen, nothing. So the body goes cold, looks white as a sheet due to no blood circulation, and eventually the muscles stiffen because there's no cell activity to relax the muscle fibers. And lastly, the blood pools to the bottom of the body due to gravity, causing this really weird dark red rash to form. The immune system's also dead, so there's nothing stopping bacteria and insects from invading and feasting on the remains. Insects such as flies will lay their eggs in the body to hatch into maggots, while bacteria break down the cells releasing gas. When enough time passes, all of the soft bits of your body will be completely eaten away until just the skeletons remain. And that's why the skeleton is the symbol of death all around the world. Right, so essentially death is the process when your body can no longer maintain the delicate balance of system and environmental factors to keep your cells running. The definition of death itself is a massive topic, because you can imagine that it's pretty important to define when a person is dead, from medical implications to legal ones. In the past, death was defined as the irreversible absence of cardiopulmonary function, including loss of all vital signs. In normal person speak, that means that the heart and lungs aren't working, will never work again, and you aren't breathing, conscious, or have a pulse. But this is a pretty simple sentence for such a complex, varied process. There's endless philosophical discussion about the actual definition of death. For example, are you technically dead if your heart and lung functions are artificially present with the use of a bypass machine? In this case, your brain might be dead, but your heart and lung are still technically functioning, but artificially. If you say, yes, your heart and lungs are working, but your brain's dead, then what about when you're under anesthesia or when you're sleeping, when you're technically unconscious? Turns out the meaning of death is just as cryptic as the meaning of life. In recent years, the definition has changed a bit to also include brain death, a condition where the brain is dead but the heart and lungs are still functioning. We'll talk more about that later. Broadly speaking though, if your heart, lungs, and brain are permanently out of function, you're considered dead. This is why in medicine we talk about how you technically can't do any more harm during CPR if you're trying to resuscitate a patient. They're already technically dead. The goal of CPR is to manually work the heart and lungs to provide enough oxygen to the brain and other vital organs, in the hopes that you fix whatever made the heart stop beating in the first place, and reverse the death in a sense. Anyway, we're not in the business of spending half an hour discussing philosophical discussions, in this episode at least. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a few different facets of death. First, we'll talk about the clinical side of death. How can we die? How do we diagnose death? And what brain death is. Second, we'll talk about the biological side of death. What happens to our body as it is dying, then what happens after death. Lastly, we'll talk about some of the cultural and personal aspects of death, because turns out every culture on Earth talks about death in one form or another, surprise surprise, and it's fascinating learning about some of them. Let's start with my actual domain of expertise, the clinical side. We've already talked a decent bit about why we die. The cells don't get enough oxygen, or they no longer have a cozy working environment and they die. We'll go into the details of this more in the next section. But it's also important to learn about how we die, as in what are the different causes of death. When I was in high school, we studied Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, and I became very curious how different methods of suicide actually resulted in death. Purely from a scientific and medical perspective, much to the relief of my teacher who was peering over my shoulder at the time while I was researching online at school. Anyway, turns out that you can die from all sorts of causes, as long as it can sufficiently upset the balance of the body. Probably the most common cause of death in the world is when your heart stops beating for one reason or another. We covered this in the CPR episode, but you can have a heart attack that kills your heart muscles, or you can have an arrhythmia, or an electrical rhythm disturbance in plain English, that ruins your heart's ability to synchronize the muscles squeezing, resulting in not enough blood going around the body. Sadly, heart disease doesn't just affect elderly people who smoke every day and eat lard-fried bacon. There are several not too uncommon heart conditions such as Brugada syndrome, Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, or arrhythmogenic right ventricular dysplasia, and other lovely long-named diseases that can cause even young, healthy people to suddenly drop dead due to a rhythm disturbance out of the blue. This is why you sometimes hear of young, healthy athletes collapsing on football or basketball courts with no warning. Another cardiovascular condition that causes sudden death is an aneurysm rupture. Now, when people talk about aneurysms, there are two quite different conditions that get confused. An aneurysm is basically when the walls of a blood vessel balloons out, which creates a weak spot, making it easier to rupture. If you have an aneurysm in your brain, something that you're born with and wouldn't know about normally, this can rupture and cause a catastrophic bleed in your brain. This is typically what people mean when they say someone's having an aneurysm. The other common aneurysm is in the aorta, which is the biggest artery in your body, going from the heart through the middle of your chest and abdomen, branching off into small arteries to feed the rest of the body. People with high blood pressure or smokers can have aneurysms form in the abdominal aorta from middle age onwards, which can eventually burst and cause you to bleed out internally, if that makes sense, and die, because there's not enough blood left to sustain your brain. There are rare conditions like Marfan syndrome that can cause even young people to have aneurysms in their chest. And that's just the heart and blood vessels going wrong. What about the lungs? If you have a life-threatening asthma attack, the teeny tiny pipes in your lungs swell and shut, meaning you can't move air in or out of the lungs. The cells don't get enough oxygen, or too much carbon dioxide builds up, and you can die without treatment. A similar thing happens with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD or emphysema, where you're essentially having a chronic, irreversible asthma attack due to smoking. Seriously, kids, please don't smoke. When it comes to your gastrointestinal system, you can have severe pancreatitis that causes multi-organ failure, liver failure from alcohol or hepatitis that results in a big buildup of toxins, or bleeding due to your blood not being able to clot. Or you can also have a condition called gut ischemia when you're old, where the blood supply to the gut is blocked by a clot, similar to a heart attack. If your kidneys fail due to diabetes or your immune system attacking it, your body can't clear out waste products, and an imbalance of electrolytes such as potassium can cause your heart to have an arrhythmia. Cancers come in various shapes and form, but ultimately they spread and metastasize, consuming the body's fuel and eroding into important organs like the liver, lungs, and brain, until the body can't cope with it and eventually the whole thing fails. Gosh, and those are just a select few examples of things that can go wrong from within your own body. What about other things that can be done to the body? Infectious diseases are still a leading cause of death worldwide. This might be something like cholera that makes you have so much diarrhea that you become severely dehydrated and have critically low blood pressure, or COVID-19 that can cause widespread lung inflammation, making your lungs fail. But more importantly, severe bacterial infections cause your blood pressure to drop rapidly, which can cause vital organs to fail because they're just not getting enough blood. This is called septic shock, and it is deadly. Thanks scientists for antibiotics. The other leading cause of death in young people is trauma. There are obvious ways you can die from trauma, like being decapitated or the top half of your body being separated from the bottom half. But more commonly, death from trauma is often due to bleeding or hemorrhage. This might be externally, like being shot through the femoral artery in your thigh that causes you to exsanguinate and lose all your blood, or internally, such as bleeding into your abdomen due to your spleen rupturing when you go over the handlebars of a BMX. There are many other ways you can die from violent accidents, such as brain swelling, or having so much air leaking around your lungs that your heart can't pump blood out, so you might as well reduce the risk of all of this by wearing seatbelts and helmets and not drink driving. Oh, and don't forget all those nasty poisons. Poisons can kill you in wonderfully creative ways, such as paracetamol destroying your liver, cyanide stopping your cells from being able to use oxygen, or muscle relaxants like curare stopping your ability to breathe. I can't possibly go through all the poisons in the world, so maybe read some Poirot novels instead to brush up on them. Lastly, not everyone meets sudden violent ends. There is the so-called death by old age. Technically, this is a misnomer because old age itself doesn't kill you. Often it's because as we age, our body builds up wear and tear, until eventually one or more organ systems will fail. Often death by old age is a process with lots of cascading steps and complex interactions. For example, you could break your hip, end up bedbound after surgery, catch pneumonia in the hospital, which stresses your already weak heart, causing the heart to fail, exacerbating the lack of oxygen in your body, and then you eventually die. Or you could have severe dementia or Alzheimer's disease, where enough of your brain is withered away that your brain literally forgets how to eat or breathe. Ah geez, what horrible ways to die. Let's change the mood by listening to a brief excerpt from their wonderful song, Dumb Ways to Die.
Set fire to your hair, poke a stick at a grizzly bear, eat medicine that's out of date, use your private parts as piranha bait. Dumb ways to die, so many dumb ways to die. Dumb ways to die, so many dumb ways to die.
Much later now. Let's talk more about our inevitable mortality. So, how do doctors confirm or certify that someone is dead? To be honest, in the hospital, it's quite obvious when a person has passed away because they're constantly being monitored or having their vital signs checked. But still, when someone dies, a doctor needs to officially examine the person to diagnose the death for legal purposes. The way we confirm death is actually quite simple. Essentially, we're checking if three important vital organs are still functional: the heart, lungs, and the brain. To do this, we'll listen to the heart for any heartbeats and feel for a central pulse like the carotid artery in the neck. Next, we listen for a good 1 to 2 minutes to their lungs to see if they are breathing. Notice that it's not a 10-second job because they could be just breathing really slowly, like if the person has been given too much morphine. Lastly, we shine a light into each eye, kind of like when doctors are checking to see if people have a concussion, and see if the pupils contract. If they don't respond at all, that means that the brain is not functioning, causing this automatic reflex to not work. With these three signs confirmed, we can document that the person is officially dead, and do the paperwork like the death certificate. There's some other details like checking to make sure that they don't have a pacemaker which might explode when it's cremated, or ruling out a reason to talk to the coroner, like if we suspect a homicide or the person was pregnant at the time of death. So why do we need to go through all the rigmarole of examining an obviously dead patient who is cold, white, and stiff? It's because there's actually several conditions that can mimic death. For example, people with extreme hypothermia, or a brain condition called locked-in syndrome, can look dead, and may even look like they're not breathing. The same goes for people who have overdosed on some sedative medications. This, and comas in general, probably account for a majority of the cases of premature burials in history, where people would wake up in the morgue, or worse, in a coffin, because people assumed they were dead. On a complete side note, there is a very rare phenomenon called Lazarus syndrome, named after the guy that Jesus raised from the dead, where a person who has been receiving CPR for a long time, then officially pronounced dead, comes back to life. In most cases, the patients eventually die within days to weeks again, but it's still a baffling medical phenomenon that I'm sure would freak the hell out of the clinicians and family. The last clinical thing I want to talk about is the topic of brain death. Remember when I said that we had to change the definition of death to include brain death? This is because in certain scenarios, say a severe head injury or a brain aneurysm, the brain can die separately because the pressure is too high in the skull, meaning no blood can enter the brain. But if it's an isolated injury, the heart and lungs might be completely fine. In these situations, we can keep the body alive with basic support, like breathing for them with a ventilator. Because the lungs can still exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide and the heart is still pumping, the rest of the body can actually function reasonably well. But the problem is the brain is completely dead, so there's no one in there, so to speak. Whatever made the person them is gone. Medically and legally speaking, a brain-dead person is still considered dead, but they may be kept alive for a period of time for loved ones to say goodbye, and if there is a possibility that they may be able to donate their organs to other people who need transplants. Alright, before we take a break and move on to the next section, let's finish this section with a list of some unusual causes of death throughout history. There's the ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus, who was given a prophecy that he would be killed by the fall of a house. He was staying outdoors to avoid any ceilings collapsing on him, when an eagle dropped a tortoise on his bald head, mistaking it for a rock to shatter the shell on, so he was killed instantly. The famous astronomer Tycho Brahe died from a kidney infection, which he contracted after holding in his urine for way too long during a banquet because he thought it was bad etiquette. And who can forget Rasputin, who had to be poisoned with multiple doses of cyanide, shot in the chest, shot again because he wasn't dead yet, then drowned in a river to finally be assassinated. Lastly, there's a whole string of recorded deaths in history where people died while having sex, or la mort d'amour as the French would say. This is a pretty well-known medical phenomenon. It can happen to people who have heart disease, who end up exerting themselves just a little too hard and having a heart attack. But then again, aneurysms are also known to burst during peak sexy times, so it can trigger a brain bleed even in young people. The weirdest death during sex in history probably goes to Attila the Hundo, who on his wedding night started having a massive nosebleed right in the middle of consummating his marriage, and he choked to death on his own blood. Anyway, just a little reminder that there is no dignity in death, and death seems to have a really weird sense of humor. Let's take a break, and when we're back, we'll talk about what happens to the body after you die. I recommend not eating while listening to the next part. Welcome back. Alright, so we've mostly talked about the clinical aspect of death and the various creative ways you can die, which, believe me, I can go on for hours and hours about. So let's switch focus and talk about what happens after you die. And no, not like whether you go to heaven or hell or whether you see the cosmic owl, but more what happens to your physical body. Because I think most people's concept of what death looks like comes from media portrayals like crime shows and drama movies, or from funerals of loved ones where the body has been embalmed specifically to stop the natural process of what death does to the body. We've talked about what is happening in your body as death progresses. The heart and lungs aren't able to provide the rest of your body with fresh blood. This is problematic because cells are very complicated biological machines that require a constant fuel source to function. The main source of energy in cells is a molecule called ATP. We get this mostly from breaking down sugars, but when you're literally starving, your body also breaks down fats and proteins to make this ATP. ATP is extremely important because it's like the energy currency in a cell. If you want to move things around the cell from point A to point B, you need ATP. If you want to pump things in from outside the cell, you need ATP. If you need to cut or change a protein, guess what you need? Some cold, hard ATP. So when blood supply is cut to a cell, it can't get any new fuel, which means it can't make any ATP. Side note, you know how you learned in biology that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell? It's because it's where ATP is made. Anyway, this means the cell can't do any of its normal maintenance work, and it rapidly falls apart. Like literally. Because it can't use its special pumps on the cell membrane to maintain balance, huge shifts of ions occur and chemicals leak in and out of the cell, until the cell deflates like a sad, sad balloon. In death, this is happening to all the cells in your body, at different rates. So what do you see from the outside while this is happening? There are 4 main stages of death. First, the skin becomes extremely pale and white. This is because the red blood isn't circulating around the body, so the skin looks drained of color. If you want to be fancy and use Latin, we would call this stage pallor mortis. Secondly, the body starts to cool. You know how your body is normally about 36 degrees Celsius? This is because your body works hard to generate heat from all of its work to keep the cells toasty and warm, because 36 degrees is when proteins work optimally in our body. But if all the cells are dead and not working, there's no more heat production. So over several hours, the body becomes colder and colder to touch until it reaches room temperature. This is called algor mortis in Latin. The third stage of death is probably the most famous, and this is called rigor mortis, or stiffness. This is when a corpse becomes stiff as a board, often with arms raised or joints bent in a weird position. Rigor mortis happens because normally, muscle activity requires that magic fuel ATP to relax the fibers after they contract. But if you're dead and there's no ATP coming to the cell, the muscles will keep contracting and stiffen. But contrary to belief, rigor mortis isn't permanent. The muscle fibers eventually degrade and decay, so it will soften and relax with time, about roughly 48 hours or so. The last stage of decay is livor mortis. This is a purplish red rash like discoloration seen on the skin of a corpse, but only at the bottom of the corpse. For example, if a person died lying on their back, the back will be purple-red, while the top half of the body will be pale white. This is because without the heart pumping the blood around, the blood starts to sink down with gravity, pooling to the bottom of the body, whatever position it may be in. Because these 4 stages of death happen in reasonably predictable timeframes, forensic pathologists and coroners can use them to help figure out when a person may have died, or the circumstance of the death. For example, if rigor mortis has set in already, the person must have been dead for at least a couple of hours. If they find livor mortis on the top half of the body, then it might suggest that the body was lying in a different position and then moved afterwards, suggesting foul play. Okay, so the 4 stages of death are what you expect from roughly the first 6 hours after death. What happens next? Well, here's where the gross stuff starts to happen, and that's decay. The next stage of death is called putrefaction. Because your immune system is also made up of cells, there's nothing left in your body to fight off the invasion of unwanted guests, like bacteria. So the bacteria start to feast on all of the body's tissues, which is full of yummy organic matter. It's the same process as meat or milk spoiling. The proteins that make up the cells are all broken down, producing fuel for the bacteria. But a lot of waste gases are produced as well. This is why rotting bodies smell disgusting, because our noses are designed to pick up the scent and hate it, because rotten food is bad for your health. It's also why you hear about dead whales exploding on beaches, because the buildup of gas can result in a lot of pressure. I won't go into too much detail of what putrefaction entails, because you might not have a strong stomach, but essentially, everything in your body other than bones will rot and break down during this stage. Putrefaction starts around the 48 to 72 hour mark after death, but it takes about 4 weeks to completely finish. After that, only skeletons remain, hence the last stage being called skeletonization. Now, obviously putrefaction is a gross process that we don't want to see happen to our loved ones. This is why when someone dies, they're moved to a morgue to be kept cool to slow down the onset of decay, and then embalmed by a funeral director. Embalming is a series of processes where a body is treated so that it won't decompose for a while, mostly so that an open casket funeral can be held and family and friends can see the deceased the final time before they're buried. We won't go into the details of how embalming is done, but essentially preserving chemicals are injected into the bloodstream of the body, which gets spread all around the body and prevents bacteria from doing their decomposing thing. So there we go. That's basically what happens to your body after you die, and how we might want to slow it down for funerals. And that's probably enough talk about decomposing bodies, so how about we'll take a short break, and next we'll talk about how death influences humanity, other than the obvious way, of course. See you soon. Because death is a universal process and end to us all, humanity has been understandably fascinated with death forever. And because it's such an integral part of life, humanity has a pretty diverse, rich, and complex relationship with death. For example, let's take the personification of death. Much like death being a full-fledged character in Terry Pratchett's Discworld as an anthropomorphic personification, pretty much every culture around the world has personified death in one shape or form. Possibly because it helps us understand and explore death and dying better, when we can put our face to the concept. We can see how our relationship with death can be very variable from how death is personified through history. For example, in ancient times, death is described more as psychopomps, Greek for guide of souls. These are figures that take a deceased soul from Earth to the afterlife, like the angels in Christianity, Anubis from Egyptian mythology, or Thanatos, Hermes, and Charon from Greek mythology. But as we go into the Middle Ages, when the Black Death claimed the lives of roughly 30 to 60% of the European population, people started viewing death differently, something that takes lives rather than just escorting them to the afterlife. This is probably where the Grim Reaper, the classic black-robed skeleton with a giant scythe that cuts through your soul from your body, originates from. And it's not surprising, if you saw more than half the people around you dying at the same time, you might also come to imagine death as an apathetic farmer, reaping souls like they were autumn harvest. But even still, death isn't usually portrayed as a bad or evil character. It's just a natural process, something that is inevitable. Funnily enough, in Korean mythology, the beings that take you to the afterlife are called 저승사자, or emissaries of the afterlife, and they serve Yomna-daewang, the god king of death. If you've seen Dragon Ball Z, this is the same being referenced as Yama. The funny thing about 저승사자 is that they're not portrayed as fearful, scary spirits, but more as calm, public servant types who are just doing their jobs to collect the souls from this life and bring them to the afterlife. They're even described as being paid low wages and sometimes being tricked or bribed by humans to extend their life, only to be yelled at by the god king of death, so pretty rough life for them, or afterlife. There are similar stories in Greek mythology of Sisyphus outwitting Thanatos and trapping him to cheat his own death, which is the reason why he's being punished to pushing a boulder up a hill for eternity. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but I thought that it's funny that even an all-powerful, life-ending force like death is portrayed as being rather human in some mythologies. Perhaps it was a way for people to soothe their anxieties about the unknown world of death by fighting it with humor. So, going back to medieval times, you often see skeletons as motifs of death throughout paintings. But they aren't there as villains, or as a reminder of our mortality. It's as if our ancestors have always understood that death is not something to fight against or to fear, but something that is always hanging over us, like the sword of Damocles. This is the philosophy of memento mori, which is Latin for remember that you die. This philosophy is found throughout the world for thousands of years. From ancient Roman generals having dedicated slaves whispering to them that they are mortal to keep them humble, to various medieval fresco paintings portraying the dance of death, an allegory that no matter how rich or powerful you are, we are united by eventual death. Memento mori is a powerful, sobering thought. It teaches us that no matter what we achieve, what our fears are, who we become, or where we come from, it does not change the one simple fact that we will all die one day. It sounds like a stressful, frightful thing to think about all the time, but it's extremely humbling and reassuring if you really think about it. For me, personally, it's not paintings or whispering slaves that show me memento mori, it's my experiences in the hospital. As an emergency doctor, I've met countless people who are dying or died in front of me. Sometimes it would be an elderly woman at the end of her journey with lung cancer. Sometimes it would be a poor boy killed by a severe head injury because the brakes jammed on his e-scooter. I've met people with terminal illnesses smiling as they told me about how they have no regrets in life, and I've met people begging to let them die because they have no quality of life left and they don't want to live in their broken shell of a body anymore. I've seen people look at me with intense fear and horror in their eyes while gasping for oxygen. I've seen people quietly, peacefully passing away amidst unconsciousness surrounded by their loved ones. And I felt what it's like to let go of the last breath from a bag valve mask, knowing that the patient's heart was never going to beat again, and they'll never ever take a natural breath. All of these experiences have taught me that even though we might all have different ideas and beliefs about death, from how we personify it to what we believe happens after, to imagining what our final moments might be like, it doesn't change the fact that it will happen, and it can happen anytime. And I think it's that knowledge that really helps me frame how I see life and the world. Makes me think about what really matters in the grand scheme of things. Is it finding success in a meaningful career or leaving my name in history? Or is it enjoying the time I have doing things that I love with people that I care about? It makes me feel absolutely grateful for all the happiness in my life, knowing that it may be fragile and how it can be taken away in a freak accident instantly. It also helps me to make choices in day-to-day life, because my wish is that I'd like to look back from my deathbed thinking that I have very few regrets. So it pushes me to take action, like protecting my work-life balance, investing in my hobbies, and telling my family and friends that I love them regularly. Anyway, that's a personal example of how the philosophy of memento mori, the knowledge that death comes for us all, helps us live our lives more meaningfully. In an odd way, the meaning of life and the meaning of death are just two sides of the same coin, entangled and inseparable. So as cliched as it might sound, it's worth living each day as if you might not have another. Carpe diem, or hashtag YOLO, depending on what generation you're from. Now, I too find the topic of death and dying absolutely fascinating, so I could spend hours and hours talking about various things like voodoo death and fan death, the concept of immortality and cryogenics, silly way people die as seen through the Darwin Awards, various depictions of the afterlife in various cultures, or the idea of dying well and palliative care, but we need to draw a line somewhere, so let's call it a show here. So what did we learn today? We learned about what death is, when your heart and lungs can't function anymore, and your brain doesn't get enough blood and stops functioning too, permanently. We learned about many ways you can die, and how doctors diagnose death. We learned what happens to our bodies when we die, how our cells break down, and how our bodies go cold, pale, stiff, and purpley before we break down into rotting dust. We learned that death and humanity have an ever-changing, complex relationship, with death affecting every part of human lives, from philosophy to art. We learned about the philosophy of memento mori, and how knowing that we'll die someday can actually help us live fuller lives now. Alright, for today's 2-minute explain, let's talk about something that might help prevent a freak death, the brace position. If you've ever flown on a plane, you've seen the brace position during the safety briefing that you totally pay full attention to every flight. The brace position can look different from airline to airline, but the gist is that if a plane is going to crash imminently, the flight crew inform passengers to assume the position to increase your chance of survival. The general principle of the brace position is similar. You bend forward while seated with your seatbelt on, have your feet flat on the ground, and cover your head with both hands. Now let's address the elephant in the room first. If the plane you're in explodes into a ball of fire, yes, the brace position isn't going to help you much. But, fascinatingly, the brace position has been shown to significantly reduce your risk of serious injury or death in most plane crash scenarios, thanks to the work of numerous researchers over the last 20 to 30 years. The brace position might appear simple, but it's meticulously designed to reduce the risk of injury from various sources. For example, In a crash, the sheer force of inertia versus the seatbelt restraint across your waist results in the body jackknifing, as in fold over at a ludicrous speed. This can break your spine in two while rupturing your abdominal organs. The brace position helps prevent this by keeping you bent over and curled over in an arch. Head and neck injuries are common due to breaking seats, falling luggage and debris, etc. These can cause serious head injuries and brain bleeds, so protecting your head is paramount in a crash. Keeping your head tucked between your legs and shielded by your arms also prevents whiplash injury of the neck and limb injuries from flailing like a wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man. And those are just the main ways you can be mortally injured in a plane crash, so next time you're on a flight, do listen to the safety briefing, because the brace position might literally save your life. Oh, and to give you more hope, statistics are on your side as well. Turns out your risk of dying on a flight is only 1 in 60 million, which is far, far lower than the risk of dying from a car accident, being hit by a bus, having a burst brain aneurysm, or even being hit by lightning. Because thanks to science and safety research, modern planes have heaps of safety features, the brace position included. So you actually have a 95% survival chance in an airplane crash. Even in a serious crash, the survival chance is 76%, which is not bad. So hopefully that's a more positive ending to the podcast. But don't forget, it could happen anytime. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Explain This. I hope you've learned something interesting and maybe even useful today. Well, hopefully the philosophy stuff was more useful than knowing the stages of death and decay, but whatever floats your boat. Also, a special shout out to Carlos, who wrote a lovely email to me during the hiatus to tell me how much he enjoyed listening to Explain This. I really appreciate hearing from you all, so do send a friendly email or leave a comment so I know you're listening. We'll see you in 1 month's time because I'm stepping down to a monthly schedule this year. Anyway, we're back, so until next time, bye for now. Explain This was written and hosted by me, Jin Kim. If you'd like to suggest a topic or just send a lovely message, you can email me at explainthiscast@gmail.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter